morning. Thank you everyone for joining AOBA's Emergency Preparedness webinar. In our series on elevators, this is our second webinar on this important topic. Just for your information, this session is being recorded for the playback pleasure of anyone you'd like to forward it to. Safety codes for elevators have been recently updated. Today, we're going to discuss the latest information on elevator safety for your property, both on the residential and the commercial side. There's been elevator code updates. We're going to give you tips on how your building tenants and residents can get ready for modernization, how to properly test equipment for code compliance, and incorporate one-way video and two-way text communications into your building safety program. Today, we're excited to have industry leaders from our local AOBA chapter joining. We have Kings 3 Emergency Communications, Action Elevator. We have a testimonial from Cove Property Management and Arundel Elevator Inspections that are going to be happening today. So I'd like to, just as a quick reminder, in the days of webinars, please use the chat feature for any questions. We do already have 5 questions in the mix for the end, and stay muted until the end of the Q&A, and then we'll open it up with the questions. Thank you very much for joining your time, and I'd like to turn it over to James Bowers with Kings 3 Communications.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We've got a lot of good information for you folks today, so we're going to try and get through it fairly quickly. And we've got some other groups on the panel here, or some other folks on the panel who can chime in and help fill in some gaps where we may have some questions come up. So again, my name is James Bowers. I'm with Kings 3 Emergency Communications. I'm in my 19th year at Kings 3. Currently as the Solutions Engineering Manager, recently taking on the product specialist role, overseeing all of the ASME and IBC code updates pertaining to elevator communications. So on the next slide, we'll tell you a little bit about Kings 3 and then get moving on the content. So we were founded in 1989. Our sole focus is emergency communications for commercial and residential multifamily properties. We've got roughly 100,000 phones online right now across North America. And from those devices online, we receive 1.8 million calls on average every year, which averages to 3.4 calls every minute of every day. From those calls, on average, monthly, we receive 1,200 entrapment calls. And in addition to those entrapment calls, we also receive calls that require us to dispatch either police, fire, or EMS on average of 800 calls per month. Our dispatchers are trained in AEMD. They're certified in Red Cross CPR and HIPAA training. Lastly, is our customer retention rate is at 98%. So moving on to today's discussion, what we're going to talk about today. What you were briefed on at the beginning is elevator communications. Some of the changes in the telecom industry that are affecting elevator communications, and then as well as some of the code updates that are affecting the communications. So moving on to the next slide, if you would, please. I want to get into first talking about those changes in the telecom industry and what updates are taking place. So as of August 2nd of this year, 2022, the FCC issued an order that basically lifted the responsibility of telecom providers to provide service to the old, outdated analog POTS telephones lines, as they're called. POTS, for those that you don't know, stands for plain old telephone service.
Mark, this is Doug with Focus Staffing Group. I wanted to reach out. I'm working with an outstanding senior property manager seeking a new opportunity.
Okay, so the FCC tells the telecom providers that they no longer have to service these lines if they are in need of being repaired. So what that means is they gave them a 3-year window from the date of August 2nd, 2019 to provide a new solution. And basically that was to accelerate the investment in broadband and digital and new technologies that the telecom providers are providing. That doesn't mean that excuse me, I'll back up. So they gave them from that date in 2019, a 3-year grace period, or a 3-year time frame, you might say, to provide new service to those POTS analog telephone lines that are no longer functioning. That went into effect after that 3-year period on August 2nd of this year, like I said. So now if you have an analog telephone line that's being used for your elevator or any other service in your building that goes down for whatever reason, that telecom provider is no longer required to reestablish the same service on that analog telephone line for you. They can now provide you a new technology, either broadband or digital service. So what does that mean for elevator communications? The biggest player in the telecom industry to replace those analog telephone lines is voice over internet protocol, or voice over IP, or as you see here is VoIP, is what we refer to it as. Voice over IP is a great solution for your general telephony use or your business use, you might say. They're easy to set up. They're fairly cost efficient. Quite oftentimes you can use the equipment you already have in your office and tie it into a VoIP system to make your equipment that you have work. There are a lot of great benefits to using voice over IP for your business or your office or whatever uses you may have for general telephony use. There are some shortfalls when we're talking about using voice over IP, excuse me, in an emergency phone application. And really, I've got 3 bullet points that are deterrents that I see as to why we should not use VoIP in an emergency communication situation, and particularly for elevators, what we're talking about today. The first point being that the elevator code and building code states that the elevator communication system has to have a sufficient backup battery supply in case of a power outage and that system goes down. The communications in your elevator still has to function for a period of 4 hours of talk time, is what the code refers to in the event of a power outage. So these VoIP systems that are installed for your business, they often don't consider that when being put in for general use. Oftentimes they don't have backup battery power. So if you were to lose your power in the building, you lose your phone system as well. Some of those that do have backup power, they're not considering, again, that code requirement for elevators. So they're not going to provide enough of a backup battery to meet that code. Secondly is what we call automatic location identification. So code states that if you're trapped in an elevator and you press that phone button to reach authorized personnel, that authorized personnel dispatcher has to be able to identify where you're calling from down to the description of the elevator without being told by the person in the car. Location identification. The way we accomplish that at Kings 3 is by using what are called DTMF tones, dual tone multi-frequency tones. These are the touch tones that you hear when you press the buttons on your cell phone or on any phone. These tones are used in an emergency scenario to transmit the necessary account information for that particular elevator car to the dispatcher to let them know where that call is coming from in order for us to meet code. So when we're dealing with a VoIP system, those DTMF tones can often be reconfigured, portions clipped off of the beginning or the end, all reasons for us to receive a phone call, but we don't know where that call is coming from. The alarm handling software that our dispatcher is using doesn't recognize the DTMF tones because of that VoIP system causing that break in communication. And then lastly, the third point, reason we wouldn't want to put VoIP in your elevator is calling back into or reestablishing a connection with that car. For whatever reason, if the dispatcher loses connection with the car, or they need to reestablish a connection, say they need to receive more information from the passenger or give information to the passenger, they need to be able to ring back into that elevator, and that needs to be an automatic process as well, meaning that there should be no interaction from the passenger in the car to reactivate that phone. So those are the three main reasons we don't want to put VoIP or digital service in your elevator. So the recommendation from KEEMS 3, you'll see here the third bullet point under emergency communications, is a cellular connection. A cellular connection, we've come to find out through our business, it's referred to as what's called an M2M connection, meaning machine to machine. So you have one gateway or one connection, one phone line leaving your building with that call information to dispatch. So it's from the elevator machine, one connection, to the dispatcher's receiving side. We find that there are benefits to going with the cellular connection even over the POTS or analog lines. One of the main benefits that we see is, so say ASME code requires that the call be answered on take no longer to be answered than 45 seconds by authorized personnel. So on average, with an analog POTS line, we find that it's about 30 seconds to answer. And with that cellular 4G LTE connection that we use, it's on average of a 7-second connection. So it's a much faster, much more reliable than even the standard analog telephone lines. One other point that I'll mention regarding the cellular connection and touch back on the VoIP connection that I didn't touch on before was another requirement that's written in ASME code for elevators for elevator communication failure alert. Basically what this is a device that monitors your telephone line voltage, and there's a flashing LED and a buzzer, an audible buzzer that would sound, and that light would flash in the event of a loss of phone line voltage. This is to alert somebody walking into the elevator when you push the button at the hall call, oh, this light is blinking and the buzzer is flashing, telling me that there's no communications, or excuse me, no emergency communications in this elevator. So with the VoIP system, it's oftentimes difficult to physically even make that connection because we've got a digital 4-pair Cat5 connection that's not giving us the correct voltage. I'll try not to get too much into the technical weeds here with you guys, but there are challenges with getting that communication failure to work with a VoIP system. With a cellular connection, it provides the correct voltage. It works as intended. If that voltage is lost, it will sound that buzzer and make that light flash for your communication failure. So that's really all I have on the phone line connection types, but this is a good time to segue into the next portion, which is going to be the added requirements of putting video stream and two-way messaging in the elevator car for emergencies in the event that the person trapped in the car is unable to speak or hear. So that being said, in addition to the phone line, we now have hardware in the system that, or in the elevator, that requires an internet connection. So the phone line is transmitting the voice communication via the phone that's installed in your elevator. Now we have a video feed showing the entire cab, including the cab floor. We also have a screen in the elevator that the authorized personnel or dispatcher can populate messages that can be responded to by the passenger non-verbally. This is all, I'll give you a little bit of the timeline on this in just a minute, but it was all done basically to cater to those who are unable to speak and or hear and have a need, they have a need that is not being met by just the two-way voice communications in the elevators at this time. So let's talk about how do we get internet into your elevator car in addition to your phone line. I've found really that there's two ways to accomplish this. The first one being, you'll see LAN or LAN/VLAN. This stands for Local Area Network or Virtual Local Area Network. And basically this is an IT term for you guys bringing a wired internet connection into your elevator equipment and providing that network through your internet service provider. There were some red flags starting out with this. We saw as a company with putting third-party devices that, we're not totally sure what the level of firewall security is on these, because they are a fairly new development. The manufacturers who make these devices, I'm sure they have that R&D, but there's potential for cybersecurity risks. If you have a network, say, for instance, we have clients who are banks, national bank chains, who had to install these systems at one of their properties early on. And that was their first concern was, we don't want these devices on our network because we store sensitive client information on this network. Well, that's a valid concern. There's a strong potential for cybersecurity risk there. So the second connection type that we found to be much more secure, it's very reliable, and it kind of reduces the level of coordination between vendors that you guys may struggle with at times. And that, again, is a cellular connection, just like we recommend for the phone. So this would be a separate device that would be installed for your cellular connection for the phone. This device would just provide a pathway to the internet. And basically what that does is it allows that video and two-way messaging hardware that's installed in your elevator car to be online, so that in the event that authorized personnel needs to access the camera feed and send those messages, that cellular connection is there to provide that. Again, with the coordination between vendors, it can be challenging to get an ISP fully understanding, yes, this is for emergency services, but certain restrictions are not needed. There's a lot of conversations going into, you might say, that just need to be had to make sure that everything's ironed out. And we found that just by going this route, it's a plug and play solution. It reduces or circumvents the need for a lot of the in-house wiring, and works really well. And so moving on, lastly, the last bullet point on the connection type here, I've got QoS written down. So QoS basically stands for quality of service, and this refers to a technology in IT, basically, or networking, that if you do have an emergency device on your network, you need to be sure that the quality of service is prioritized for that device, meaning that other traffic on your network is not going to get priority over your emergency communications. Okay, so we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, Cynthia. I want to talk about one other service that actually you can get through Kings 3, but is provided by AT&T. And that service is called FirstNet. And this is a network that AT&T built on the heels of the 9/11 attacks, when the cellular networks were exposed to be, they weren't up to par for that type of catastrophe. So AT&T builds this network called FirstNet that is basically a separate band from the general traffic on any other network. And it was built for first responders and public safety use only. So it's a platform, I'll just read this to you. It's a nationwide communications platform that allows public safety to coordinate emergency responses efficiently and effectively across agencies and jurisdictions. A separate, dedicated, highly secure network core, purpose-built for public safety sensitive communications, and innovative tools like relevant applications and connected devices to give public safety more actionable information for heightened situational awareness. Okay, so one point that comes to mind that we've learned through AT&T, as we are a an authorized vendor and equipment provider of this AT&T FirstNet network. That last bullet point about the innovative tools is they shared something with us that, people who are in territories that may deal with natural disasters, hurricanes, flooding, anything that has the potential to take down a cellular tower, which in turn would take down the cellular network. They have tools such as drone technology, where they have a base station, and these drones provide the cellular tower. Basically, they fly up and they take turns on the charging base, returning back to charge, and then the other one taking its place up in the air to provide that cellular tower network. They have mobile towers that are on long bed trucks that stand up like you might remember from the NASA videos that you've seen, things like that, the rocket standing up. So those are just some ideas of how AT&T is addressing the first responders and public safety in the event of a catastrophe that may take down the network. So we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. And this is where I wanted to kind of give you an idea about the timeline of how we got to putting video and two-way messaging in elevator cars for emergency communications. So in 2018, IBC, which is International Building Code. So for those of you that don't know, International Building Code, when we're talking about elevators, your elevator is going to be inspected to that International Building Code. So they have to have their version of elevator communications in their code. ASME is the code that's written pertaining to elevators in particular. But IBC is kind of where we saw the idea for video getting started. So they initially wrote this version of the code that basically states a visually and text-based and video-based 24/7 live interactive system, fully accessible by the deaf, hard of hearing, speech impaired, and include voice-only options. Also has the ability to communicate with emergency personnel utilizing existing video conferencing technology, chat text software, or other approved technology. So I want to touch on bullet points number 1 and number 3 real quick. Number 1, where it says video-based 24/7 live interactive system. So the intent here when IBC wrote this was for them to make the ability for the trapped passenger who cannot either speak or hear have a real-time video feed of authorized personnel and vice versa, meaning that they can see each other in a video feed in real time and perform American Sign Language back and forth. Secondly, the bullet point number 3, where I mentioned existing video conferencing technology, chat text software, or other approved technology. The chat text software that they were referring to here, also the intent was for there to be the ability for the entrapped passenger to free type messages back to the operator, meaning that there needed to be a full keyboard in the elevator. So between the requirements, or the intent of the requirements being real-time two-way video to perform ASL, and having that fully functioning keyboard inside the car, the fixture companies and manufacturers who are developing these devices were unable to meet this requirement. So it was written into the code, but there really wasn't any movement on it that we saw for those that adopted it. So go ahead and move on to the next slide for me, please. Okay, so this is a little bit out of place, but we'll just roll with it. We'll get into what ASME wrote about the video code in just a moment. But before we do that, let's run through what they're telling you your emergency communications had to do prior to 2019. So first, it obviously has to be a hands-free device that provides two-way communications between the elevator car and authorized personnel. If your elevator travels over 60 feet of rise, you have to have that on-site communications to communicate with the car. We call that a master station device. It has to be answered 24/7 by live authorized personnel and not automated answering. And on to the next slide, please. That automatic location identification that I was talking to you folks about when we were on the VoIP connection, that's written into the code. Calling back into the elevator, again, written into the code, and automatic redirector if no answer on site. So that basically means if your dispatch center is tied up and it rings more than a certain number of times, it needs to roll to a secondary number that can be answered. Offsite communications cannot interfere with on-site. That means that master station device, if you have it on site, is if it's connected with the elevator car, the offsite dispatcher at authorized personnel cannot call back in and break that connection. And then finally, the local phone status monitoring is that elevator communications failure device that we talked about that sounds the buzzer and flashes the light if you do lose your phone line voltage. So that's what ASME said the elevator phone had to do prior to 2019. If we can move on to the next slide, please. This is what they added in 2019. So they more or less hear about the IBC ruling and write this version into their elevator code. So number one includes two-way text-based messaging capability for those who are hearing and or speech impaired. Second, include video capability. And third, display a message, no longer just a light to indicate a call has been received and help is either on the way or on site. So that light meaning, you press the button on your phone in the elevator. Prior to this, you had the red blinking LED. It says something to the effect of flashing light indicates call has been received. So this now takes the place of that light. You have to have a message inside the car on the screen that says help is either on the way or on site. I see a bunch of questions rolling in here. I'm not ignoring them. I do want to get through the content here though, and we'll get to those in just a moment. Okay, so go ahead and move on to the next slide for me, please. All right, so what I want to do now is walk you guys through what a call process would look like that comes into our emergency dispatch center from these devices. So you'll see this slide here shows a picture of one of our dispatchers' workstations. And the monitor on the left shows what we call the alarm handling software, where this tells the dispatcher where the call is coming from, everything about that account down to the description of the elevator, the emergency contact list, the elevator service provider company, everyone that, anything we need to know about that property and that device. So then the screen on the right, you'll see that there's a window that shows a video feed inside the elevator car. So this is basically a web-based platform that the manufacturers who build the hardware provide to the dispatchers to view inside the elevator and send and receive those messages. So that the right side of that screen, the big white box, that's actually a chat box. Yeah, right there where the button is. That's where they can type messages in that are populated on the screen inside the elevator car. Okay, so if our dispatcher here at Kings 3 receives a call from one of these devices, they're going to answer the phone as they typically would and ask, what is your emergency? If they do not receive verbal response or a verbal response from anyone in this elevator, and it has this, this device, they can now begin nonverbal communication by activating the in-car camera feed. And if you'll go to the next slide, that'll look something like this. And you can see that this visualization I've given shows the entire cab floor and all four cab walls. I want to point that out just to reiterate that the intention of the code is to see the entire cab floor. In the event that somebody is incapacitated and may be laying on the floor, we can't have a camera positioned on the wall that only sees, from the waist down or whatnot. It has to show the entire cab floor. So back to the call, the operator's on the phone. They have not gotten a verbal response, so they have activated the in-car camera feed. They do see that somebody's in the elevator, but has not responded to them verbally. They can then begin nonverbal communication by posting messages to that in-car screen. And the next slide will show you what that looks like.
And just really quick, James, great content, but we're on a time constraint. So I just want to make sure that
Yeah,
the other
we're
speakers.
just about done. I've got about 30 more seconds here.
Awesome.
So
Thank you.
yeah, this is what the screen is going to look like in the car. And you can see that the questions are listed are phrased in yes and no format. And the reason that is that the manufacturers are designing these in a way that you can see that the door open and door close buttons are what are used in this event to respond with yes and no. So we can ask, are you trapped in the elevator? They can respond yes. Are you able to hear me? They can respond no, things of that nature. Okay, so I believe that's it. If you go on to the next slide, this just shows a table of kind of the evolution of the code of what's been added throughout the years from 2000 to 2019. And the last column there shows that we've added the video to view inside the car, the two-way messaging, and the 60 feet of travel device. Okay. And then this is just telling you that you do have to have that emergency phone, the video messaging system, the internet connection, and then that on-site device if you're over 60 feet of travel. And then recommended minimum standards. We can send this out to everyone so we don't have to go through this in too great a detail, but basically it gives you a checklist or something to reference when you're maybe auditing your emergency communications at your property and that monitoring service. This gives some some bullet points that you can go off of when you're making those decisions. And that should be it for this slide. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Katie, who she's a property manager. She's going to spend a few minutes going over how this is impacting her side of the business. Thank you, Katie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how to prepare your residents, your team members, and really the building for modernization, sharing some tips on how to have a smoother process, and also some of the challenges that you may experience during modernization. There is, kind of one, both positive and negative, is that there's a significant amount of lead up time before, from when you make the decision, okay, we're going to modernize our elevator, to when the physical work takes place. And I really encourage you to take advantage of that time to prepare as much as you can, so that you're not having surprise situations and you're not kind of running around. You're able to know where you're going before an issue happens. Perhaps the most important part of really any project is communication. For our residents, we sent out multiple notices that were, positive and excited, because you want to make sure you have that resident buy-in, but also realistic and honest, explaining what situations are going to happen, perhaps some of the inconveniences, without using that word, of course, that they're going to experience. So we were sending out notices in advance, perhaps a month in advance. And then once we had an actual specific launch time, sending out an additional notices, and then weekly or bi-weekly as needed during the entire process. You also want to make sure that your site team, is knowledgeable about what's going to happen and how the process is going to work. You of course want to have a single point of contact who is on site most days or all days, but also make sure that every single team member, from your porters, your leasing agent, and of course your manager, understands what's going to happen, and is part of that process. Really give them buy-in, because every single team member is going to approach an elevator modernization and the effects that it has on residents, vendors, and buildings in a different way, because they have different points of view. You're also going to want to make sure that you're really communicating with your elevator company. Before a modernization, you're of course going to have some meetings with the elevator company. They're going to run through what to expect and kind of a rough timeline for modernizations. but you also want to make sure that you are doing, you know, that your site point of contact is having daily check-ins, because that's really going to catch a lot of the issues and inconveniences before they happen, so that you can communicate those things to the residents. Because really, at the end of the day, you know, when residents know what to expect and when they feel empowered and part of the process, you're going to get a lot less complaints than when something happens in kind of more of a surprise, and then the resident feels frustrated that they weren't included and they didn't know what was happening. Also really, you know, encourage you to become an expert as much as possible on the modernization process, on what it looks like, on what steps are being taken, but also, of course, accept that you have limitations. You are, you know, if you're a site team member, you are not an elevator technician. You do not do modernizations every day. So know who to call, you know, build those relationships before everything starts, so that when situations arise, you have those experts to refer back to and to support you. You might have, you know, a sister property that went through modernization, you know, a year prior to you. Reach out to them. You know, maybe there's industry partners that can help you, but really, you know, make sure that you're using your resources. Something that really helped us when we were doing our modernization was kind of trying to overplan and run through hypotheticals as much as possible. For the most part, you know, if you're doing an elevator modernization, you have probably experienced elevator outages. So think about, you know, what situations arose when you had an outage. You know, there's obviously kind of the base level, residents can't get to their homes via the elevator, but, you know, think about while you're doing a modernization, are you doing all your elevators at once? Are you doing, you know, do you have 2 elevators and you're going to do one and leave the other in service? You know, are your elevators on opposite ends of the building, where maybe a resident has never used the other elevator and now they're going to have to find their way there? Make signs, explain it to them in the notice that goes out that week to say, hey, this is going to be happening. You know, these are the tools that we've given to you. Because again, let those residents feel like they are part of that process. One major challenge that we experienced when we did a building that had 2 elevators is that there were 2 very different size elevators. One of them was kind of the primary move in, move out elevator. And while we were doing that one, we really only had a very small elevator that was mostly designed for passenger transport and not furniture and that kind of thing. So we really had to coordinate and to think about that while we were modernizing that larger elevator. You should also make sure that you're really, you know, preparing for outages. While the elevator company is going to do everything in their power to not have them, it is inevitable that it is going to occur. You know, think about how, you know, do you have residents that rely on the elevator to travel between floors, that they're not going to be able to use the stairs? Are your stairs in a good condition? I think that most site team members will begrudgingly admit that the area of your building that probably receives the least buff and shine is going to be your stairwells in an elevator community, because people really aren't using them on the regular basis. You're not getting eyes on them as much as your elevators, as your hallways. So before the modernization starts, I encourage you to, you know, check your lighting, check the signage in the stairwells. Are residents going to know when they've gotten to the floor they live on? Because the last thing you want to do if you've been forced to climb, you know, 7 stairwells is to realize that, oh, you went 8, now you've got to go back down. My last kind of final tip for you, and something that was really beneficial for us in our modernization, was, you know, we had all elevators that were the same vintage and the same manufacturer, and we were able to save parts from the elevators that were modernized to extend the life of the elevator that we hadn't yet modernized. You know, the modernization process is pretty expensive and obviously is very, you know, time consuming. So it just wasn't possible for us to modernize everything all at the same time. So having those spare parts that were no longer being manufactured, having them, you know, already on site, reduced the downtime that we had on those other elevators. So we can move on to the next slide, and just talk about some of the roadblocks and the challenges that, you know, that we faced and that you may face in your modernization. The biggest, of course, is, you know, move-ins and move-outs. If you're reduced and you don't have as many elevators, it just makes that process a little bit more complicated. You may not have that second elevator that you can lock and put into independent service for your move-in. So some things that we did that were really successful, and really just helped us get through the process, you know, in a little bit of a smoother way with less inconvenience to our residents, was we sent our renewal letters out early so that we knew what, you know, what our exposure was, what our turnover was going to be during the modernization. We also, you know, looked and said, okay, why does the quieter months of our season, where we are going to see less turnover, less lease expiring, and we scheduled our modernization for that time. We also incentivized early renewals, you know, lock people in so that we're not seeing the turnover. Because again, you know, while turnover is never fun, it is especially not fun when you're in the middle of an elevator modernization. We also considered, you know, large appliances and large deliveries, and part of our notices to residents was, hey, if you know that you're going to be getting a new couch, you know, while we're doing this modernization, let us know. Let us coordinate that in advance so that you're not having this you know, new furniture delivered that then can't get to your home because the elevator that you need to use is not available at that time. Certainly, you know, resident project fatigue when you're doing a modernization, and Chase will go into a little bit more detail about the timeline and how much it takes, but you can anticipate somewhere in, you know, in the realm of 3 months per elevator. So residents, you know, they get a little tired of it. You're potentially looking at, you know, half of a lease term. If you're doing 2 elevators, half, you know, 6 months, half of a lease term for a resident, they're in this modernization. So, you know, I encourage you to plan extra resident events during that time. This is going to, you know, hopefully help kind of keep your residents happy and engaged with the community, but also give them a little bit of an opportunity to ask questions of your team members in a way, you know, where you're able to address those situations, you know, before they're in the point of anger and frustration, where they're maybe going to email your corporate office, or they're going to just say, you know what, I want to move out because I just can't deal with this anymore. Or, you know, post a bad review of your community. You know, really trying to catch the situation, catch the issue before it gets bigger. A very costly challenge that we experienced was our fire and life safety system was not going to be able to perform and meet the code requirements that a modernized elevator had. So we ended up actually having to replace the entire fire and life safety system, including going into every single resident's home, you know, congruently with our elevator modernization. We also had to do work on our generators, work in our elevator machine room. So, you know, really make sure that you're, you know, as you're preparing for your modernization and as you're thinking about all the factors, make sure that you are, you know, are really thinking about the building as a whole. What are there other projects that you're going to need to consider, and perhaps that's going to impact, you know, the level of modernization that you do. And then obviously I touched on a little bit, Chase is going to go in more detail, but modernization lead time, you know, we saw when we did ours, it was, you know, from the day we decided, yes, we want to do a modernization to the day that we started, we were really looking at the better part of a year. And so you certainly, you know, don't want to wait until your elevator is, you know, down and no longer functioning to say, hey, I'm going to do a modernization now and get this thing working, because you really need to be preemptive in this. And so I think that is all that I have for you all. I hope that it is helpful, and, you know, as much as modernizations are a challenge, they are very exciting. It is wonderful to get a new product and to see greater reliability in your elevators. It really makes the day-to-day afterwards a lot easier.
Thanks, Kate. And Chase, you're up next.
Chase, you're on mute.
Thank you. As Katie touched on, I'm going to elaborate on some modernization timelines as well as some additional tips for proactive planning and touch on code update of reopening devices with the 2019 code. So first, it's just imperative, as Katie mentioned, to collaborate closely with your building and your elevator contractor. First process of the step is to identify the right scope of work. Upgrades to the control systems and mechanical components. Are you going to be looking to upgrade the cab interiors, aesthetic upgrades in your lobbies, things like that? There's really not one size fits all solution for modernization. You're custom tailoring it to your property. For the scope of work, this can typically be generated by your elevator contractor, or you can hire a consultant to develop and write a specification. Varying levels of project complexity can dictate what goes into the stage, but often things like building and tenant traffic flows can help assist to determine what exactly needs to be done and replaced. Examine code updates, exactly what we're doing right now. New requirements from the original install date to current code, as well as existing building systems, like building related work. As Katie mentioned, they had to update their fire alarm system, life safety, electrical, mechanical systems that all tie into the elevators. We also recommend getting budgetary pricing or a capital planner to kind of get an idea of what this will cost and make sure everything's in line on that front. Pricing for multiple contractors is recommended, and estimated pricing for the related work scope is also recommended. It can be handled by the building or by the elevator contractor. It doesn't matter who, it just will have to be done. A lot of times we see in the DC market that the elevator contractor will serve as the general contractor subbing out this related work, kind of acting as a prime contractor. Another helpful tip during this process is if you have a sample contract to review, it's always nice to provide that to expedite the process once things get moving. And lastly, just remember that a modernization is a major construction project taking place in a finished and occupied building. So to plan for disruption and the planning phase is the time that you might want to entertain expedited schedule or working on off hours to minimize this disruption. Some timeline durations to run through quickly. After you're through the bidding stage and contract execution, elevator contract will have a submittal and engineering phase. That typically can take 8 to 10 weeks. Again, as mentioned earlier, there's not really one size fits all. Every project will vary, but there's a substantial amount of time on the front end before they'll have boots on the ground actually doing the work. Once you get through the submittal and engineering phase, equipment will go into fabrication, which can take anywhere from 10 to 20 weeks. This is the time that you really want to have that strong tenant communication, plan any contingencies if you have medical offices that are on upper floors. Also, time to implement a maintenance enhancement program. The existing system has been determined to be modernized. So when you take out the first unit for mod, there's going to be a lot of stress on the existing equipment. And lastly, for install, the project varies on the scope of work. On larger jobs, the project duration and install can last over a year. And once the project starts, you should plan for the elevators to be out of service for the duration of the project. Basically, in summary, it could be anywhere from 6 months, even after you've given the green light to your elevator contractor, before they'll have guys actually on site starting the modernization. I also wanted to discuss the power operation for hoistway and car doors code update with the 2019 code. New requirements have been introduced with the 2019 edition of the code regarding reopening devices used in power operated horizontal sliding doors. The new code states that the elevator reopening device will have to detect persons or objects that are approaching the entrance of the landing doors up to a speed of 3 feet per second, and objects moving towards the entrance between 9 inches and 20 inches from the landing side of the hoistway door, so from the lobby side. Traditionally, 2D systems have been used, which is basically an infrared cross screen that detects an obstruction. When you throw your hands in front of the door to catch it, to get it to reopen. The new 3D system that's being enforced now or adopted is very similar to that. It leverages the same technology, but the beams are also reflected outwards towards the lobby landing, creating a detection zone, as you can see down in that photo below. Some of the 3D drawbacks are the sensitivity issues it creates, false triggers from reflective or shiny flooring, and 3D zone picking up static objects such as cleaning carts or cross traffic that aren't intended to go into the elevator. And because of that, many manufacturers are introducing smart systems to help eliminate false triggers and still satisfy the 2019 code requirements. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim, who's going to elaborate on some additional code updates with the 2019 code.
Hey guys, I lost my voice on Monday, and I think when we did the prep, they assumed I wasn't going to have much to say, so they put me last with 7 minutes left. So, Cynthia, how much time do we have left?
I think we can go till 12:15 if, because we have a couple of questions to answer. So yeah,
Okay.
no
I'll
worries.
be brief. So I've been doing this for about 30 years, and I do recommend getting elevator consultants involved when you're doing a modernization, just because I am an elevator consultant. So to Chase's point, it is important. If you go to the next slide. So my company, basically, we do inspections and also elevator consulting nationwide. I have jobs in Miami, Boston, Nebraska, Texas. So I'm all over the place. So that's another just part of the business. So it's kind of important for me to know the different codes in every area. The AHJ, which is the authority having jurisdiction, they're the ones that actually set the tone for what code they're going to have. Maryland is adopting the 2019 code right now, or they have October 1st. But DC is still under 2013, and Virginia changes based on the county. So next slide. So one of the things I want to talk about is the door requirements for private residents. I do legal work, and I am involved with a case down in North Carolina where basically this is a tool that you use. It's kind of hard to see. Then you can actually set it into the track of the private residence door, the accordion gate, and you're allowed to have, basically 5 inches. The 3-5 rule was the old way they did it. That's been eliminated now. Now they're making it a lot tighter. It's closer to 3/4 of an inch. So that prevents a child from being in that area when the elevator could move. Seismic requirements for elevators and escalators were basically clarified. You have different groups writing both codes, the IBC and then of course the ANSI or ASME. So this year they were able to kind of bring them together. So now we have a little bit more of a collective. They were just clarified, so they're matched up. Updates were made to, of course, the emergency communication, as Kings 3 mentioned, and then Chase just talked about the requirements were modified for the increased door protection. I think this is going to be a good part of the code. I'm hoping that the technology will allow it not to be an issue with doors reopening more than they should. I've done a lot of legal cases where people are trying to get to the door. They don't quite make it to the car door, is where your door protection is. They get hit by the hoistway door, which could be 4 to 6 inches difference. And they get struck and knocked to the floor. And it's really, unfortunately, it's really nobody's fault, but there's just no protection on that. So now the code's actually updated it. So now they have a little more protection. Next slide. You guys may be curious, what is a QEI inspector? How do you become one? Basically, the code allows you to work as an apprentice in the field for 1 year, and then or be a union mechanic or certified elevator mechanic. And then with those credentials, then you can sit for the certification. Typically, it's a 1 week course, and then you pass the test, and then you have to do annual renewals for just training. Next. Building requirements outside of inspections or the elevator company. Of course, you have annual testing for the elevators company. We need to make sure the documentation is there for the annual testing and also the 5-year test. Most jurisdictions require there to be a test tag on the controller and then also paperwork in the machine room. Monthly fire service key switch test is normally handled by building personnel. It requires you to go out to the lobby, recall the elevators on phase 1, call the cars down, and then each elevator should be tested to make sure it goes to another floor and then recalls back to the main lobby. Other things you just have to be aware of, just making sure you have a current fire alarm test done. Maryland has eliminated the requirement to test heats, but it's still required in DC and Virginia. Making sure we have current fire extinguishers, and then also making sure your generators are tested on the annual and 5-year basis. Next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Maryland. The role of the DLR is basically they're supposed to make things safe, send certificates out to properties. They issue roughly 30,000 certificates each year. They're still responsible for doing finals on new equipment, and anytime elevators are upgraded, even whether it's a full modernization or just like a door upgrade, you're still required to have the state come out and actually witness the test for the alteration. And they also do a third-party monitoring program where they come in behind third-party people and make sure that they are doing the inspections the correct way, make sure they're doing it safely and filling out paperwork as required. Citations, I put that in red because that is a loser for most folks. Unfortunately, they're sending out quite a bit of fines right now. Once you go past, normally it's 30 days past your certificate ending, and they haven't received the paperwork from the third-party inspector, they will issue a $750 fine per elevator. So if you have a bank of 10 elevators, it's 10 times $750. And then if you, for some reason, can't get the elevators inspected in a timely fashion or get them re-inspected if there's violations, then you could very well get a willful fine, which is normally $1,000. And then they can typically charge you up to $5,000. So, and the other thing they do is accident investigation. So next slide kind of goes through the numbers I just said. So you just really need to make sure that you get things done in a timely fashion, whether it's Maryland, DC, or Virginia. Everybody has a slightly different program for doing it, but you want to make sure that you stay on top of that because that can cost you quite a bit of money. And kind of what Chase alluded to was some of the getting materials is tough right now. Getting manpower is tough right now. So if you were to have ropes or something like that that need to be replaced, then you may be waiting a couple months for you to get both the material and the labor to do it. Next. Maintenance and fines. Basically, I always tell people, when you write contracts with the elevator companies, try to get on your own paper. Your paper is going to be more beneficial to you than their paper. You can always put their paper as an attachment, but your terms are always better in your words. So, whose paper did you use? Does the contract cover all the equipment? Elevator consultants and inspectors, they can help you make sure that these are done correctly. I had a job probably 10 years ago where the guy gave him a contract. He said, man, this is such a great deal. And so I looked at the contract and it didn't cover any rotating equipment. And there's a lot of things in the elevator that rotate. And it was a very interesting little phrase they put on there, but basically it meant anything, a wheel, a roller, or a machine, anything that turned, moved was not covered. So while it was a good deal initially, he was probably going to spend quite a bit of money on repairs. Again, is your elevator company performing? Are they doing the maintenance that's required? Are you having shutdowns, callbacks? Are they meeting their contractual responsibility? Are they overcharging you for services? A situation where, you may be getting bills and bills for something that should be covered in your contract. And new code impacts for your building. That's kind of what we're talking about today. And go ahead, next slide. This is just, that's the end of my presentation. I try to do as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much, Tim. We appreciate it. Lots of great information, and we have so many questions. I'm going to start with a few that came in reverse order. Are you aware, can someone answer these questions? Are you aware if any of these upgrades from POTS to cell dialers will be covered by the telecom provider or will be at the expense of the building owner? Just the upgrades from POTS to cell dialers.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, that's a great question. And from what we've seen in the industry, the telecom providers are not providing or covering the cost of that upgrade. And oftentimes they may not even provide you a sufficient solution for emergency phones. Again, we have to remember that backup battery requirement. So basically the answer to your question is no, they're not on the hook to get this going. That would be on the building owner to make those changes.
Wow, I think that's great information. What daily safety checks can be on-site, the on-site maintenance staff can perform? What safety checks can the on-site maintenance staff perform? That would be helpful. Anybody want to?
I'll go ahead from Kings Three's point of view, and I'm sure Chase and Tim and everybody can chime in as well. But we recommend at Kings Three that you check your emergency phones at least once a month. And by checking them, you press the button, the operator comes on, you tell them you're the manager or whoever you are with the organization, and that you're testing your phone. Our dispatchers are trained to receive these calls. There's no need to notify us ahead of time. We recommend that if you do have an engineering staff or something like that, and they have a weekly checklist, you could add it to that weekly checklist. But just be sure that you're testing those communications devices often, so that you're not stuck in a situation where you may have an inspection not pass, or worse, you have a situation where somebody needs those emergency services and they're not functioning. So from an emergency phone standpoint, that's really all I have to say about that.
Yeah, and I would agree with James. The other option you would have is when you do your fire service testing, you could do it at the same time. It typically doesn't take very long to get a hold of an operator. So while you're doing the phase 2 portion, go ahead and hit the button and just verify that everything is working on both the fire safety side and also the phones.
Right. And just from my point of view of being out in the field for so many years, I ran across, several, property managers and engineers or whoever it may be. When I install a new system and go to show them how it's working, there's a lot of hesitation, or people are timid or slightly scared to reach out to emergency services just for a test. I can tell you, we'd much rather receive those calls than the call saying that there's an inspector there and the phone doesn't work.
Good point. Is there a specific response time that by law or by code that a monitoring company should be picking up for an emergency, for an elevator
Right.
call?
Yeah, so ASME, I don't think we covered that for you guys. If anybody doesn't know, ASME stands for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. That's the organization that writes elevator code. ASME states that call has to be answered within that 45-second time frame from the time of activation.
Thank you.
And remember, when we were talking about the connection types, an analog line gets you there in about 30 seconds. And the cellular connection on average for us is about 7 seconds, but the requirement is 45 seconds.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Are there any recommended safety features for new construction that are not required by code, like something they would need to do that's recommended, but it's not required? And somebody also asked about this jurisdiction. Is it just Maryland, Montgomery County, or is this DC and Virginia wide as well?
So as far as Maryland's jurisdiction is the entire state. So just quickly, I can touch on too. I saw another question come in. For Maryland, this has already gone into effect for any new construction and modernized elevators. So this isn't retroactive, but in the entire state of Maryland, the 2019 code is being enforced since October 21st of this calendar year. For DC, it is currently not adopted the 2019 code. And to the best of my knowledge, there aren't any publications or intent to adopt. But I'm sure it'll be not, long behind. And then for Northern Virginia, their adoption of the 2018 building code is kind of what's triggering these 2019 code elevator code updates. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. And I think we're going to unmute Ross, so he can ask some questions instead of typing them. Ross,
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. So ultimately, this code, we don't have to, the only time that this takes place is if we modernize the cab, right? Or do a new development, a new build. Is that correct? Like we're grandfathered in basically until we modernize.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Anytime you need to pull a permit, meaning modernization or new construction, that's correct.
And you're talking modernization, like overall, like cab renovations or equipment modernization. You're not talking like some type of door closer that I need to install, or like a detector edge or something, right?
The controller is typically your trigger. So if you replace the controller, that's when you have to bring everything up to current code.
Okay, and that's for Maryland, but not DC as of yet, and then also not Virginia. I missed that last part. I apologize.
That's correct.
Not. Not VA, okay. And then what, I heard that some of the stuff triggered our fire access system when you did some of these modernizations where you had to update the entire, FACP. Is that, what were those things that triggered, like what caused you to replace these fire systems because of this elevator modernization?
So typically you need to have primary, alternate, and flashing hat zones in your elevators. So some of the older
Yes.
systems may have had primary, they may have even had alternate, but they may not have the ability to add any more zones to it. Then the zone for the flashing hat is the machine room and also the elevator hoistway. So that's why sometimes the systems just aren't capable of having anything added to it. And that's when you have to basically replace a system, which means either
Yep.
a standalone system that then somehow triggers the old system, which sometimes that's not allowed either. But that's what causes that to happen.
Okay. All right, that was all very helpful. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ross. Somebody asked the question for James. The property already has cameras. Can I use those cameras?
Okay, great question. And I'm assuming you're referring to if you have cameras in your elevators. So this has been brought up several times, and the answer to that, the short answer is no, and I'll explain why. So you may have cameras in your elevators at this time that are used for surveillance or security. Those are tied into that CCTV system on your property. There's no way to tie those in as a secondary use for your emergency systems. The fixture or the package that you buy from the fixture company is going to have that camera included along with the screen and all of the hardware required to perform that two-way nonverbal communication. So the answer to that is no.
Someone asked, where would a radio mesh network be approved? And is this considered a cellular network? Radio mesh network.
That sounds like another communications guy question. So yeah, those are basically the same terminology. If you're referring to if you think about your cell phone, each phone is a transmitter basically, and the network transmits that signal back to the main transponder. That's basically the idea of a radio mesh signal as well. So they're basically one and the same as far as we're concerned.
Thank you very much. I think that's the end of our questions. We appreciate everyone's enthusiasm and asking questions and making this a robust webinar. Again, this session was being recorded. If you'd like to ask any questions, the last page has the points of contact on there. If you'd like to ask any of the speakers directly for that, we'd be happy to forward that along. Thank you very much for your time and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.